Hello, my name is Mark Durand, and what I'd like to do is to explore three challenges related to fieldwork in extreme contexts, and very specifically, the extent to which these challenges risk making us traffickers in pain. And the three challenges are: number one, exploitation; number two, complicity; and number three, voyeurism. They're not the only challenges, but I think these are challenges that will be useful for us to explore. Now, let me tell you beforehand that I have no real answers to them. These are issues that I've run into every single time when I do my field work. And I think very typically, in the absence of finding solid responses to them, I think we end up in a place where we can at least live with ourselves temporarily. But it never seemed, to me at least, to be perfectly resolved. So let me tease these out and let me use as examples some very well-known photographs. So the photograph you see here was taken by Dorothea Lange. It's entitled Migrant Mother. She took it in February 1936 as a stint that she did for the government's Farm Security Administration. They paid her to go around and document the lives of migrant farmers. And so what you see here is a 32-year-old woman. As she was approached by Dorothea Lange was sure that she had implicit permission to take the photograph. Took the photograph. The photograph became very, very well known. Dorothea Lange built a phenomenal reputation based on this photograph and made some money on the side, which of course the one featured in the photograph got nothing out of it whatsoever. When she was interviewed in the 1970s, when they finally found out who she was, she expressed some real resentment towards Dorothea Lange about this issue. There are many examples just like it. Here's a well-known example from the South African photographer Roger Ballen, which features a set of twins from a genetically not particularly diverse sort of part of population. And again, you can't help but this feeling somewhat exploitative, where we realize full well that our success or the success of our work, whether we are photographers or ethnographers, is directly contingent on other people who are very unlikely to benefit in any way, shape, or form from any of our work. Now, this is not only well known within photojournalism, but of course also in journalism. There's a wonderful opening paragraph in a book by Janet Malcolm. The book is called The Journalist and Murderer. And the paragraph goes as follows. It's a beautiful and very powerful opening to the book. She says, every journalist who is not too stupid or full of himself to notice what is going on knows that what he does is morally indefensible. He's kind of a confidence man, preying on people's vanity, ignorance, or loneliness, gaining their trust, and betraying them without remorse. It may sound harsh, but I'm not sure that what we do is all that different, right? Because the friendliness that we leverage to secure access and to continue to secure access on an ongoing basis, that friendliness is entirely weaponized. It's weaponized because they have something we want. And there's no other way about this. And we also know it may not end well. Right? There's a wonderful book of essays by Caroline Brettel called When They Read What We Write. And these essays are essays by ethnographers where they write about the responses they've had to their work by the people that feature in it. And it makes for very sobering reading. And part of the problem, I think, is that once you've done one ethnography, you'll very likely know that going to the next one, that people will likely object to some of what you've written about them. And quite often, at least in my experience, and it's not just my experience, I think it's very clear from the essays in Caroline Brettel's book, it's not something very specific they object to. I think people simply object to the account existing, to the fact that some issues they consider to be private, though they may not have told you so, have now suddenly become very public. Okay. And the ensuing sense of betrayal is something that we live with. Or if we can't live with them, I suppose, we give up. Right? Let me move on to the second challenge. And again, I'm using a photograph which is extraordinarily well known. Was taken by Eddie Adams in February 1968, which is when I was born. In the photograph, you see a general Lone, who has just executed a suspected Viet Cong. What's interesting about the photograph is that General Lone knew what he was doing. So he took the Viet Cong suspect to a place in town where he knew there would be journalists, including Eddie Adams. And the way the photograph is staged, really, it makes it very clear that he did this as a publicity stunt. Right? And of course, it left the photographers, including Eddie Adams, with a very strong sense that it may not have happened at all. In fact, the execution may not have happened, at least not at that time, had the photographers not been there to witness it. And so what it does, it foregrounds the notion of complicity, the extent to which things happen because we are there to see them happen. So another photograph, very well known, published in Life magazine 1983 by Kevin Carter. It shows a young Sudanese child on the way to the feeding station having collapsed, and of course the vulture behind. And Kevin Carter, when he took the photograph or series of photographs of the same scene, he knew what he was doing, and everyone wanted to know whether he'd help the child to chase away the vulture. And when he finally came clean on the eve of the award ceremony at Columbia University, said that all he'd done is he kind of sat around for 20 minutes, trying to get the best possible photograph, hoping that the vulture may spread its wings, so it would make for a more dramatic photograph. Right? And I think what this illustrates is something tied to complicity, which is not only that things are happening because we're there, as was true of the past photograph, but the extent that we should prolong suffering, because in this particular case, it might actually make for a stronger image. Right? And I think that ties to our work as follows. I think quite often, when things are happening, we wish for them to continue happening because it makes for a more interesting piece of research, a more interesting story. There's a very powerful example, actually, of complicity in an account by Jonathan Mannon, where he tells of a period when he went to visit his pals post his fieldwork. He started his fieldwork with the police, as you may know, in the late 1960s. He wrote most of it up in the 70s and 80s. In the mid-70s, he returned to see his police pals. They invited him to go around with them in a car. They were called into a bar. There had been a disturbance, and the bar was a drunken man. They took him outside and they started beating him. They started beating him in front of John, and not only that, but when John got into the car, they put him into the same car and continued to beat him until they were at the police station, and beat him, John said, to within an inch of his life. I interviewed John recently about this incident, and it's been 50 years, but he still very clearly remembers what happened. As he says, and I'm reading now from his interview transcript, he said, they beat the shit out of him on the street. I'm just watching. And they throw him in the back of the van, up in the front with the driver. They're driving to the jail, and I can hear the beating going on in the back. They were showing off. They were showing off that they didn't take shit on the street. They knew what they were doing. They probably would have ignored this case had it not been for my presence. And so while John never called for the beating, he couldn't help but feeling he caused a beating that might have never otherwise taken place. But it took place only for him being present. It's of course very hard in situations like this to know what to do. Should you intervene, like Kevin Carter might have done in this photograph? Should you stand up? Should you stand down? What should you do? And this, I think, is where complicity becomes at its most subtle. Very, very many examples of this, actually, within the ethnography literature, particularly when you look also at sociology, social anthropology. And the final challenge is related to voyeurism. It ties into the Kevin Carter photo in the sense that something, for it to make a better story or potentially better, more insightful research, we simply wish for it to continue to happen. Right? And again, you've got many examples like this, not only in photography, particularly in documentary photography, where suffering in some ways becomes our bread and butter, and not theirs. And therein, of course, lies the obvious problem. Let me end with a photograph from my own fieldwork. This photograph is is one of many, featuring a high double amputee, which is was a signature injury in the summer of 2011, which was the deadliest and bloodiest summer of that war. And I showed, not because it's spectacular, I showed you because I distinctly remember what I felt taking it. And, to me at the time, it was just another high double amputee, and it sounds horrible to say this. And I think I dare say it in part only because much of that feeling was shared by the surgeons. But you get into a state whereby you've seen so much of the same thing that the suffering other becomes completely detached from the observer, which is you or was me at the time. And so what you start to hope for is difference, for different stuff to happen, or for stuff to become more severe, more extreme, more serious. Because it makes, again, for more interesting research, a more interesting story. And I think that realization of what you've become, that you become effectively numb to the suffering that you witness, and it will ultimately be something that you will be writing about and that other people will be reading about. I think that observation of that numbness and the desire for something more exciting to happen is both deeply shameful, but also something that I know is a relatively common experience in the field. I'm not sure how to resolve it. I mean, the two suggestions going forward that may not resolve issues, but may help compensate for the damage we, I think, as ethnographers cause. I think one will be to write auto-ethnographically, which is us writing ourselves into our accounts. And the idea behind it is very simple, which is that if we make them vulnerable, the very least we can do is to make ourselves vulnerable as well. And so we're trying to kind of compensate for that vulnerability. The problem, of course, is that we are the ones to define what vulnerability implies. And we will never know how vulnerable our work has made someone else, or indeed how vulnerable our presence in the field has made someone else. But we do control the extent to which we make ourselves vulnerable. And so it's a strategy going forward, but it's imperfect. The other approach would be to write an account and let it be read by the people that feature in it, and then give them a platform that allows them to respond to our account. And so ideally what you would do is you publish an account, but rather than just publishing the account, what you would also publish are the responses by the people featured in the account to the account. Now, again, there might be drawbacks. So we might start to self-censor in a way we might not otherwise have, because our work will be read and responded to. But it is, it's not a bad way forward. And there are certainly examples within ethnography a bit like it. All right, so I'll leave it there. So what you have are three challenges of exploitation, complicity, and voyeurism. I think these challenges are particularly acute in the context of extreme context research, because they risk us becoming traffickers in pain if we not already are, right? So let me leave it there, and we'll talk to you soon.